Welcome to Front Running 2020 with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacy Herbert. As we look ahead to the 2020 election, looking at all the policies and issues, today we're going to take a deep dive into China.
And China, is it forcing us into a Sputnik moment? Now, of course, Donald Trump ran in 2016 on Make America Great Again, and part of that is now a clash with China. Joining us to discuss this issue is Dan Collins and Marshall Auerback. Now, according to the IMF, using purchasing power parity, China is already 25% larger economy than the United States. Dan Collins, of course, you lived there for 20 years. What did you see? Here you're in Brooklyn, as you can hear around us. We're across the river from Manhattan. You're seeing a construction boom here by U.S. standards. But put this into context of our competitor nation, as Trump calls it. What's going on there compared to here?
China has a distribution economically, of course, and so do we, right? The economy in Brooklyn, where we're at, is going to be different than Little Rock, Arkansas. China today, they passed us on a PPP basis on the GDP back in 2016. So it's been a few years already. Well, the way I like to look at it, too, if you just step back and look at it from an economic standpoint, they make their shoes and they make our shoes. They make their TVs and they make our TVs. They make their car parts and they make our car parts. So I think their economy, the way we estimate it, is their economy is absolutely massive. You go any city in China, they basically have new airports, new roads, new buildings, new schools. So there's just been a massive economic boom that probably is going to be difficult to keep up. And I personally believe China's GDP the last few years is much, much lower than the official statistic.
Right, so looking at some of these technologies like 5G with Huawei, they are leaps and bounds ahead, right? So continuing on the Sputnik moment, we had the Cold War frisson going on with the Soviet Union that seemed to get the NASA program going, which gave us a lot of new technologies, and that was a huge boost to our economy. Should we look at this in a similar way and saying, look, they are clearly ahead of us. Huawei and 5G, they are ahead of us on that, and is what they are also way ahead of the US in AI, artificial intelligence. So is that how we should approach this, you think?
Absolutely. There's a lot of areas of the economy where China has caught up or surpassed us. The mobile payments market's 50 times the size of the US. We're over here still writing checks. Our banking system is not innovated. The 5G, we've kind of recently woken up the last couple of years and go, wow, we don't even have a company that can make 5G equipment. Huawei is the 800-pound gorilla of 5G. They've been putting hundreds of billions of dollars behind this company. They have 100,000 engineers. 50,000 engineers are foreigners. They've hired the best talent in that space to produce a 5G equipment. We're so far behind, the game's over. I mean, you can't catch up on 5G at this point with Huawei.
And as a geopolitical superpower that we are in the United States, and we're a competitor to China, we're seeing with 5G, because the U.S. doesn't even have one single manufacturer of this telecoms equipment, we see Germany, we see Brazil likely to do deals with Huawei despite the U.S. saying no. What do you think of this?
Well, they certainly are putting pressure on the Europeans not to do 5G, and indeed also the same question is confronting India right now. President Modi is also being pressurized not to adopt Huawei's 5G standards. So the question is, if you want to use the Sputnik analogy, the Russians were ahead of us when they launched a man into space before we did, and the U.S. mobilized its considerable national resources and ultimately caught up and did surpass the Russians. I would say that it's not impossible that the same thing could happen, but of course it would mean invoking things like national industrial policy, which is something we haven't liked since the 1970s.
How much of this, of course, is to do with the fact that when you ship all your manufacturing overseas, when you ship it to China, it was always, the theory was that they're just going to do the low value-added jobs, the tedious menial labor, and they'll never do innovation and come up with the great ideas. We're going to innovate here. But of course, innovation happens on the factory floor. Yep. And how and why did we send our factories over there? What role did Bill Clinton do with basically fighting to have China be part of the World Trade Organization? In 2000, he argued in front of Congress. In March of 2000, he said, by joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products, it is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. Of course, this is the sort of lie we push on ourselves when we invade a country, that we're going to go liberate the women. And here it was like, we're going to liberate their economy.
It was the China fantasy, the idea that somehow if they start to embrace capitalist forms of economic development, they're ultimately going to evolve into a liberal democracy, and that's turned out to be a complete delusion and fantasy. In fact, you can argue that even the idea that trade liberalization would ultimately work in our favor, it hasn't. There's been a number of studies suggesting that our manufacturing sector has been devastated by this. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP is at its lowest point in 72 years. So this idea that we retain the software, but we offshore the manufacturing, that's going to be great for both sides, a win-win. It's been a win-win for China, and it's been a lose-lose for the U.S.
Right, I'm looking at a quote from Biden here, one of the candidates, of course, who said, quote, "China's going to eat our lunch. Come on, man."
Yeah, he hasn't been doing particularly well in the polls, and I think part of the reason for that is because he still uses a playbook that's about 20 years out of date politically and economically.
Of course, he was part of the government when Bill Clinton, the great Democrat, shipped our jobs overseas. And it is interesting that we've come full circle, that Robert Lighthizer, who was almost the lone voice in the neoliberal American economic and political system back in the late 90s, he said in a piece in the Wall Street Journal, no, the New York Times, he warned that if admitted to the WTO, mercantilist China would become a dominant trading nation. Virtually no manufacturing job in the U.S. will be safe. He was right. Today, he's now the U.S. trade negotiator against China. When you're reading the Chinese press, how are they looking at Trump? How are they looking at Robert Lighthizer in particular and their trade position against China?
So Trump was kind of an X factor. They didn't know how to deal with Trump. I mean, Trump has not acted like a normal politician. They know how to deal with the Biden family. They gave his son a $1.5 billion. So that's how you can deal with some politicians. Trump is all in negotiation. He realizes, back to the point of the manufacturing space, you can't continue to innovate when you don't make anything. All the innovations happen on the manufacturing floor. And we had this illusion, and a lot of it comes from academia, these economists, that you don't need to make anything, manufacturing's going away. The reality is we've just had the greatest manufacturing boom in history of the world. It just occurred in China, not the United States. And we've gotten rid of all our jobs. You can't have a country of 330 million people and not be able to make anything for yourself. And Trump realizes that, and this is all part of the strategic kind of realignment that is going to have to happen.
And to be fair, I think there's been a number of economists now that say in retrospect that whole model was wrong. Even Paul Krugman has dared to admit that he might have overestimated or underestimated the impact of allowing China to go into the WTO, and this idea that free trade would somehow be great for both sides. And I'm personally, regarding Lighthizer, I think he's the best thing that's happened to the U.S. Economy and the government. He's probably the most qualified guy in the Trump cabinet. Granted, that's not setting exactly a high bar, but he is an exceptionally talented trade negotiator, and he's the first guy that we've had in that position who not only is a dominant voice, he superseded Treasury, which was basically happy to offshore those jobs so long as the capital markets were happy. But he's been doing this for over 40 years. He's been doing this since the Reagan years.
So the Democrats aren't discussing this issue in particular, actually, during their primaries. But will it become a huge issue against them in the race against Trump?
It certainly, if Biden is the nominee, it will, because he, as you pointed out earlier, Biden embodies the so-called Washington consensus. But there are signs that some of the other candidates are embracing a different approach, notably Elizabeth Warren. She came out with a paper about economic patriotism and reviving in manufacturing. So she seems to be adhering a bit to that playbook, and I think that's a rather hopeful sign as far as the Democrats are concerned.
Right. Well, aside from the economic advantages or disadvantages and shifting jobs overseas, it does appear China's making a pretty aggressive move militarily. And so just looking at some of the trends coming out of there, they've perfected the railgun technology that they can now put on a naval vessel. I've been following the railgun technology for a number of years now. This is an electromagnetic projectile fired into, it has the range of a missile. What you can do with a railgun is you can knock a satellite out of the sky, which is, if Huawei got aggressive, they could start knocking competitor satellites out of the sky, for one thing. Number two, the U.S. can build 2 submarines per year. It is retiring 3 per year. Meanwhile, China is able to manufacture more submarines per year. So there's a military advantage there as well. Is there militaristically? Is there should that be something to?
You know, I would say that's you've got to consider the base from which it starts. I mean, we still spend on defense. The U.S. spends on defense more than the next 10 countries combined. So we spend a massive amount more money. Now, we don't spend it particularly efficiently if you look at some of the boondoggles we have out there and the political engineering that comes down. But I think we still have a qualitative edge. The question is whether you want to continue to surrender that qualitative edge, which you will do if you perpetuate this offshoring manufacturing, particularly to China.
But of course, China and the Republican administration under Trump, he's met them head on in terms of trade. The previous administration under Obama said we're doing the Asia pivot and we're going to confront them militarily. The point Max was making about the fact that we can only build 2 submarines a year, even with Trump's new funds for the military. Because you know why? Because we rely on China for many of the parts.
Right. Yep. And that's all part of the manufacturing base you have to get back. All these technologies are interconnected. Castings, forgings, electronics, embedded systems. These are all, if you can make the cars, you can make the systems and the plants, then you can use it for the defense industry. When you get rid of all that, and the Pentagon has come out with papers on this, guys, we have mostly one supplier for each type of our systems, and these defense suppliers have become completely dependent on federal government money and completely inefficient.
All right, well, we're going to take a break. We'll come back talking a lot more about China on Front Running 2020.
Is your media a reflection of reality? In a world transformed, what will make you feel safer? Isolation or community? Are you going the right way or are you being led somewhere? Which direction? What is truth? What is fake? In a world corrupted, you need to descend. So join us in the depths, or remain in the shallows.
Time after time, corporations repeat the same mantra, sustainability.
It's very important to accelerate the transition to sustainable transport.
Sustainability. Sustainable manner. A more equitable and sustainable world.
They claim their production is completely harmless.
Kalau di sini kita lihat di hampir 1.000 hektar lebih. Untuk RKK itu hampir 600 hektar. Itu untuk satu perusahaan.
Companies want us to feel good about buying their products while the damage is being done far away.
Das ist ja genau das, was die Unternehmen uns einreden wollen. Es geht nur mit uns zusammen. Wir müssen mit den Unternehmen an einem Strang ziehen, damit die besser werden. Und das führt wozu? Zu grünen Höhlen.
In a world of fake partisan news, lies, and conspiracy, it's time to wake up, to dig deeper, to hit the stories that mainstream media refuses to tell. More than ever, we need to be smarter. We need to stop slamming the door on the facts and shouting past each other. It's time for critical thinking. It's time to fight for the middle, for the truth. The time is now for watching closer, for watching the Hawks.
Welcome back to Front Running 2020 with Max and Stacy. We're talking about this new Sputnik moment between the U.S. and China. Will the U.S. catch up? Can the U.S. even catch up, Stacy, without some kind of industrial policy?
Exactly. In order to compete on that sort of scale, we need an industrial policy, I would think, because of course the Apollo program, which we introduced under JFK, to compete with Russia, it cost $600 billion in current terms. But we had the manufacturing capacity at that time. Do we need an industrial policy in order to even rise to this challenge that China presents to us?
Well, in a word, yes. We used to do the industrial policy very well until Ronald Reagan came into office in the 1980s and said that government is the source of the problem rather than part of the solution. But there's been a number of scholarly works by people like Mariana Mazzucato who have pointed out, for example, that the iPhone is a good example, which it was derived and stood on the shoulders of a considerable amount of government R&D, and the idea that these things just magically appear through the magic of the free market is just a fantasy. Given how financialized our economy is, you can't rely on the free market alone to get us anywhere near to the right kind of policy to catch China.
This is one of the things in the political stage that I don't understand, because a lot of flag waving and a lot of USA from the hoi polloi in the audience, but then when you ask them about economic policy, they hate the USA, right? It's like, no, the USA can't do anything. The government stinks. It's all about private corporations. That's where we should throw everything. And the government can never accomplish anything. And they're very negative toward their own country. So there's a duplicity there. And they don't understand that, as you point out, without the U.S. government, there would be no iPhone. There would be no internet. There would be no win in World War II. There would be no man on the moon, right? So they seem to be a disconnect.
And if you look at the things we fund, we fund the wrong things, right? What do we publicly fund? Sports stadiums. China funds chip factories. So while we're trying to figure out what happened to 5G, they just rolled out their 6G center. 6G is going to be 10x over 5G. You know, look at electric vehicles, right? They pour hundreds of billions of dollars behind EV battery maker, who's now becoming the #1 in the world and control the EV space. They have 4% of penetration of electric vehicles already, which is twice the U.S., and they're going to be 50% within a couple of years. They're rolling out EV charging stations all over the country. So they have a plan, they have a policy to dominate the century. Integrated circuits. I mentioned the chip funds. You know, USA, we used to make 25% of the world's semiconductors. We're going down to 5% because we live in a world of finance capitalism, and we're getting outplayed by China, who's really playing state capitalism.
And we have done this before. I mean, in the 1980s, there was a concern that the semiconductor chip market was going to be dominated by the Japanese and the Koreans, and we set up something called Semitech, which was a private sector consortium with the government. And effectively, the U.S. was able to leapfrog and move to the next form of semiconductor technology. It was a very, very successful project, and it was profitable. But somehow we've decided that that's not a good model to follow anymore. I would argue that that's exactly the kind of model that you can follow. And you can use the military as well. You don't have to pick winners and losers. You can just have the military saying, you know, we want, say, a vehicle with these kind of specifications. If you can build it for us, we will guarantee you a market of X. And that's the way you can actually support private industry in that regard.
Quantum computing, another example. China put $11 billion in a quantum computing center. We've allocated just under $1 billion for quantum computing. That's going to be the next big thing. So, yeah, absolutely. Look at every technology. We need to have some type of plan around it.
I mean, the absence of an industrial policy in America is quite apparent during this time of a trade war, and Trump has applied all these tariffs to Chinese goods. We've also had the tax cuts, $1 trillion of tax cuts. Where does everything go? But into share buybacks. And,
yeah, well, that's just it. I mean, first of all, the tax reform was a joke because it was basically a means for companies to use the resultant cash flow to juice up their stock prices, because CEO compensation is basically predicated on what the stock price of the company does as opposed to the underlying operations, which is why a disaster like Boeing, even though the company...
But getting back to the China policy and industrial policy.
Well, exactly. The point is that you have to direct these things in the right way. And the problem with Trump is that, he's got a handle on the the problem in the sense that he recognizes there is a problem, but he's using a 19th century solution, protectionism, tariffs, as a means of dealing with the problem. In fact, I would argue that instead of trying to dismantle China's elaborate system of state support, the U.S. should be doing more to try to replicate it and copy it, as they did, for example, under Alexander Hamilton when the big competitor was the United Kingdom.
So I would agree and disagree on some of those points. I think the tax cuts were good. On the Fortune 500 standpoint, absolutely, they weren't paying the 38% corporate tax rate anyway. They're all offshore. Everything in the U.S. has become warehousing and distribution, and you recognize your profits offshore. Small and medium-sized businesses, that's absolutely important to get the tax rate to some type of competitive level, from 38% down to 21%. Well, now we match Sweden, for instance, in the corporate tax rate. So it's not, we have the highest corporate tax rates in the world next to North Korea. That had to come down. So that's, I think, part one of Trump's strategy. Part two of the strategy is you got to keep the tariffs on because you're going to drive the manufacturing back here. You've got
How's it going to drive it back here and not to Vietnam or Cambodia or to Indonesia?
A lot of processing technologies. Vietnam has gone to Vietnam, clothes, these types of things. Keep in mind, Southeast Asia doesn't have the population or the manufacturing base to absorb all that Chinese manufacturing.
But you had lived in China for 20 years. You did the China Money Report. When the Chinese government meets and the party meets and they do a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, what sort of policy, like what are they looking at? What are they telling, manufacturers in Michigan, their equivalent, do you build this stuff?
Yeah, they do. I've met with, I don't know how many Chinese government officials, and they're all impressive. Most of them are engineers, right? If you look at the Politburo, everybody comes from an engineering or a science background. They spend decades within the CCP system, starting out in the provinces, learning how to build economies, learning how to support social systems. And at the end of decades of a career, when they're in their 60s, then they only get up to the top. We have politicians whose last job was a bartender. So that's where we're getting schooled.
But I think AOC is a fantastic leader. She's charismatic. She's articulate, and she comes up with good ideas. Our leaders, our older people that you say are great, they're the ones that have failed us. The boomer generation has totally failed this generation. We have a generation of millennials and Generation Z who have their waitresses simply because the previous generation sent our manufacturing jobs to China. So
absolutely.
how do you answer that?
The whole model is wrong. You can't keep, the argument is you've got to offshore manufacturing because you've got to compete against, the sweatshop labor in Asia, and therefore you pay your workers accordingly. And that's the soft option, and ultimately is a race to the bottom. And in fact, there's another school of thought. There was a prominent political economist, Seymour Millman, in the 1960s through to the 1980s, who pointed out that if you didn't offshore your labor, but labor was a constant or even a rising cost, that forced you to invest and move up the technological curve and go for the higher value-added type of products. And that, for example, is what's happened in Japan and Germany. They clearly believe in the importance of an industrial ecosystem. And I think we have to get back to that sort of thinking as opposed to saying, well, we're going to offshore it all to low-cost jurisdictions, because ultimately that's just not going to get you to a position where you can compete in a viable way with China.
But can you get off the addiction of short-termism? So the S&P 500, no matter what company it is, they go to the cash desk and they are going to financialization, and they typically manipulate futures products, et cetera. They don't want to look at beyond the next quarter.
Well, the part of that is the problem is the introduction of the SEC Rule 10b, which Reagan introduced in the early 1980s. Before that, share buybacks were considered a form of stock manipulation.
But it's a deregulation across the board for the last 30 years.
But the point is that if you don't...
Disbanding the Glass-Steagall,
absolutely.
go right down the list, right?
So you have to definancialize the economy, but one of the ways in which you do that is by eliminating the incentives to goose up share prices, and that has to be a necessary first step.
Okay, now we're, of course, in a trade war. There is an emergent sort of Cold War with China. First of all, can maybe this a Cold War do for American manufacturing and innovation what the last Cold War did? But also this notion of China holding so many U.S. treasuries, is that really an issue, or does that give them any power over us in any way? You don't think so?
No, that's just a bogus, the so-called nuclear option. I mean, the reality is if the Chinese want to, first of all, they'd be cutting their noses to spite their face to sell their huge stock of treasury. And in the second instance, the reality is the Federal Reserve simply debits it from the savings account into the so-called checking account, the reserve account, and boom, the money is shifted back and they can do whatever they want. But
well, they seem to be doing an end run around that by buying gold. Along with Russia.
Part of it, but they certainly don't have the. I just refuse to believe they played us for suckers on this whole. That they'll dump our treasury and that they have this nuclear option. The thing about nuclear options is when you start to use the nukes, everything gets blown to pieces. But I don't actually believe it's a real problem.
And I want to move on to the fact that if we're in a Cold War, of course, you need propaganda. And who owns Hollywood? Is it the U.S. or is it China? Because that's the biggest market.
Yeah, I mean, the second largest theater chain is Chinese owned. They own a lot of the studios now, especially minority ownerships of them, 10, 20%, some higher. There is a lot of pushback now on that, a lot of the censorship has actually moved from over there to over here because of this financial ownership.
And a lot of revisionism. Right, so we send over these war epics, and then suddenly it's the ending is different, But Tom Cruise is looking different, and they are censoring and editing.
But we don't need the Chinese to help us with self-censorship. And when you have a high degree of corporate concentration, as we do in the U.S. Right now in media, it will inevitably circumscribe the range of views that you see.
But if we're going to take on China in a race in this Cold War era, we need our better propaganda like we had in World War II. Hollywood was instrumental in coming up with great propaganda films, and if our propagandists are going to be working for the Chinese, who's going to be doing our propaganda?
There is the problem. I mean, there's a certain degree of hypocrisy. I mean, Google proudly trumpets the fact, for example, that they won't work with the U.S. Pentagon, but they are perfectly happy to help China with artificial intelligence, which of course is being used.
Well, that's a factor. If we're heading into a more contentious relationship.
I mean, I'm not in favor of Cold Wars in principle, but one of the nice things, one of the good things about Cold Wars or even hot wars is that they do engender a broader set of patriotism, and they also do tend to override the logic of pure free trade or globalization. You start thinking about activities that are consistent with broader public purpose in your own country. And the problem when you have, the irony is that when you have a very, very peaceful environment and no external threat is that, the billionaire class is able to ask like a bunch of sociopathic monsters, and there's no constraint because there's no external threat. So that's the one thing you hope that if we do have a Cold War 2.0, that somehow there will be a renewed sense of embracing patriotism and broader public purpose.
Okay, flash round. Will this new Sputnik China-America moment be resolved peacefully or more warlike? Dan?
Hopefully, it's not too late to disengage from a Cold War. We also have the issues of a Thucydides trap, right? It's the rising power versus the declining power. We need to take a step back. We need to re-industrialize here, get a focused policy, and engage peacefully around the world. Hopefully, that happens and it doesn't get out of control.
Marshall.
Cold War I did not lead to a global conflict with the Soviet Union, so I see no reason why the embrace of Cold War II, even if it does happen, will invariably lead to military conflict with China. There will be competition, but it certainly is not negative for the U.S. If they do exactly as Dan suggests.
Right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of Front Running 2020. Obviously, the future is nothing but sunshine and Chinese lollipops. Well, stay tuned for our next episode. We'll continue to dig deep into the issues and policies leading up to the election. Until then, bye, y'all.